I was just saying to Elliot backstage that I got a text saying this is the gayest audience ever, and I told him that he was going to get that reception. Good evening and welcome to the Southbank Centre. My name is Shon Faye, and it gives me great pleasure to be in conversation with the man sat across from me about his #1 New York Times best-selling memoir, Pageboy. I was going to ask you about writing about sex as a queer and trans person, particularly in the time in which we're in now, particularly in the time where you know that eyes are going to be on this book, and still that like a lot of the public might tolerate queer people, but they don't actually seem to like it when we have sex. I was wondering what your approach was to writing about sex. How hard did you find that, a challenge as an author?
I mean, to be honest, in the moment, it wasn't hard. It was very natural. I really like writing about sex. I like sex. And for me, in regards to what, you and Sarah Schulman are speaking to, is yes, there tends to be a lack of this. And when I'm reading a book by a trans or queer author and there's any kind of sex or intimacy or sensuality, I do feel something in me go, because you realize how rarely we get it. And everything cishet is just sexual all the time. Movies, television, advertisements. It's like, calm down. And so for me, it was important. I like reading it. I enjoyed writing it. It was more when I was sending it to certain people who having said sex with, I wasn't sure how they'd respond, especially the specific chapter called Your Heavenly Daddy. And the response was awesome. I couldn't believe it. She was just like, it's great. I was like, okay, cool. Off to the races, I suppose.
I think what's striking is, I mentioned Juno at the start, a much beloved film. We're about the same age. I can really distinctly remember going to see Juno and that character and how unusual that character was, at that time. This was a huge career high and something that, will always be part of your body of work. But for you, this was actually the beginning of a whole new raft of problems.
I really did have a wonderful time making that film. It was one of the best filmmaking experiences I've had. I feel really grateful that I got to play that character who was fresh. There was something new, and I do think that my queerness was a part of that, made it special. And then when it came down to the movie premiering and the movie starting to be a success and making a significant profit, I was told to not be myself, to disguise myself, to hide the woman I was in love with at the time. And that sort of magic and that spark, so to speak, was squashed. And I think then, and even still now, I struggle to talk about how difficult that time was, because it's like, I'm so sorry you got nominated for an Oscar and had to wear a dress, And I don't not understand that reaction, but I was actually very, very unwell. That was not a celebratory time for me. I was going the heck, this isn't what I don't actually think this is what I want to do.
Do you have concerns about how do you struggle to keep that balance about the boundaries around where you're concerned that the interest in your gender identity, which is a really small part of who you are, doesn't get in the way of your artistic practice as an actor?
I guess for me, in regards to that, similar to the anxiety I felt before coming out as gay in 2014, getting to live my life actually did just become way more important than being in movies. And what you say is true in regards to how people are perceived and how that could potentially affect a career. And I don't think everyone was coming from a place of malice at the time when they were encouraging me and telling me to be closeted, essentially, but from a place of protection. But that caused me far, 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 far more harm and damage. And so all I can do now is see what happens, but living my life and being alive just intrinsically means more to me than acting in movies, even though I love it.
Could you talk a little bit about how you now make sense of the harm that was done to you by homophobic and transphobic environments you were in, and particularly about your relationship to anger about that and resentment and forgiveness as well?
Yeah, I mean, if anything, sometimes it almost more feels like grief or something in regards to knowing how much it did affect me, how it does affect us. There's some people I have less forgiveness for, that I still need to work on the anger that I feel, and sometimes I think it's absolutely fine to be angry. I think there can be healthy anger. I think a lot of the time I swallowed all of that and internalized so much of it, and then that turns into, the shame and embarrassment and discomfort that drastically impacts your life, But so many people in my life, we've had beautiful, emotional conversations with apologies and a new sense of understanding and being able to move through a lot of the anger. I'd say I feel it's funny, the tropes with tea, I feel the least angry I've ever felt, yeah. And I think that's also a ripple effect of self-love on some level.